Welcome to Nightmares Incorporated, where our goal is to make your sleep anything but restful. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's tale, entitled, These Things Unseen. I was an urban explorer once upon a time. Had a YouTube channel that I would upload my explorations to. This was back when urban exploration was kind of the rage, and you'd see at least 7 exploration videos suggested on your homepage if you clicked on just one of them. Now, most of these weren't actually exploration videos, mind you. Many of them were student horror films in the found footage genre, or hoax videos looking to be featured on a clickbait top 10 compilation somewhere. But there were a few of us that were actually out there doing what we advertised, delving into the forgotten places, the abandoned buildings, the ghost towns, the very places that gave rise to the sublime horror of liminal spaces. While my channel wasn't very big, I was starting to gain some traction, and I had certainly put up some solid content. There was my trip to a small automotive factory in Detroit that had shut down in the late 90s for one. The sight of the empty floor, with the exception of various pieces of equipment that had either been deemed not worth selling or taking or stealing. Broken lifts, lonely hammers, and floor jacks with busted handles. Broken glass on the floor, of course. There isn't an abandoned building in America that hasn't had at least one rock thrown through a window, I think. There was the empty break room and offices, cut-off electrical cords hanging from the ceiling and out of the walls, graffiti art decorating several areas. Some of it was pretty decent artwork. The rest was just some douchebag with a big ego throwing up his illegible name and nothing else. I enjoyed making the video, and it's the one that started getting me some attention. I think that's because a majority of people who watched it got the same feeling from the place that I did. While some people certainly thought that the empty factory was scary, but they were in the minority. A majority of folks just thought it was sad. And that's how I felt about it. I remember feeling melancholy while I filmed the empty locker rooms and the soaped-over windows. All I could think about was the hundreds of people that had passed through this place before it had been abandoned. People raised families from the money they made working there. They sent their kids through college or helped them get their first minimum wage job sweeping up the floor at the factory. This place had once provided a decent living for a lot of folks. And then one day, it was just shut down, abandoned, left behind for whatever came next. The surrounding area seemed to be abandoned too, in a way. The middle class going below the poverty line in one generation in some cases. I found it all incredibly sad, and I think that came through in the video. I think that video resonated with a lot of people. I followed it up with a trip to the ghost town of Womack, Wyoming, an oil field town that had been established during a boom period and abandoned once the work dried up. I felt the same sense of sadness as when I was in the factory, but it was also a very creepy place to be. The abandoned, ruined houses, the empty local grocery store and post office building, nature retaking the town little by little, overgrowing the burnt husk of an old trailer house, grass growing up through the cracked pavement, a small playground sitting alone and rusted. For me, the town of Womack was more creepy than sad, and I hustled out of there well before sundown. It just didn't seem like a place that I should stick around in after dark. For my first Halloween episode, I traveled to Joseph Psychiatric Hospital, which had been abandoned in 1968 due to a patient riot that nearly destroyed half of the building. Now that place was scary. Nothing happened in there, mind you. But the atmosphere was oppressive as fuck. And being even vaguely aware of the conditions most patients in mental hospitals were living in back in those days only added to that atmosphere. It made for a good Halloween upload, as hospitals in general are spooky places when empty, and a mental hospital that operated back during the time when electroshock therapy and lobotomies were considered standard treatments made for a prime horror setting. It was very easy for me to imagine the patients that were once housed there. Some of them wrongfully committed against their will for conditions such as nerves or hysteria, and of course, certain sexual preferences. Of course, every sound that I heard in that place made me jump, as it was easy to imagine restless spirits walking the halls, still trapped within their prison even after death. However, I didn't see any ghosts, and every noise had a logical explanation for it. It was a good video, though, and started building me some real momentum for my channel. Viewer engagement was improving, and the people who watched my stuff appreciated that I wasn't constantly trying to shoehorn in jump scares or trying to make things sound creepier than they appeared. And of course, with the increased attention, came the requests for places that people wanted me to explore. And that's how I first learned about the Shady Willow Hotel in Coleman, Virginia. The Shady Willow was a 5-story tall, pretty upscale hotel that was in operation until 2005. In July of that year, a fire had broken out on the 5th floor, trapping most of the guests who were staying up there. Being the peak of tourist season, the hotel was running at full capacity at the time of the fire. The top 2 floors were severely damaged, and all told, 44 people were confirmed to have perished in the blaze, and one person was deemed missing after rescue crews could not find the body of a man named Clark Ashton within the wreckage. The lawsuits that were filed against the corporation who owned the Shady Willow, due to what the fire investigators found to be a fault in the floor plan that led to many guests becoming trapped on the night of the fire, effectively shut the hotel down for good. The bad PR would likely have been enough to render the building abandoned for the foreseeable future, but the 40-plus settlements that were paid out in what was reported to be in the millions each all but ensured that the Shady Willow would not be repaired or rebuilt. For the next 10 years, the devastated hotel sat abandoned, likely on the demolition list of the city, but constantly slipping through the cracks, as is the case with many abandoned structures. Of course, it had the reputation of being haunted for the first few years, given what had happened, but soon the urban legends surrounding the building died down, and some who were interested in urban exploring became aware of it. A few of them had posted their trips to YouTube, so I watched them to see if it would be worth my time to make the trip. As many of the comments in my videos had said that were requesting me to look into the Shady Willow, the videos I watched only featured the first 2 floors of the hotel. People wanted someone to go higher into the building. While I understood the request, I also understood why the people who had made the trips before me hadn't ventured to the higher floors. Seeing as the 5th and 4th floors were both reportedly damaged by the fire, there were several safety issues to consider when planning an expedition. There's no telling how much structural integrity that top floor would have considering the fire and subsequent water damage from extinguishing it. There was also black mold to consider, which can wreak havoc on the lungs and would likely be present considering that I'm sure not all of the furniture on the top floors would have burned up completely. So given that there was a chance of ceilings collapsing on you, the floor breaking out from underneath you, and the possibility of black mold completely wrecking your lungs, there were some genuine concerns about a thorough exploration of the hotel. However, there was the issue with the body that was never found, Clark Ashton. There were rumors that Mr. Ashton was the individual who had started the fire in the first place and escaped before the conflagration got out of hand. But given the intensity of the fire and the amount of damage that was done to the top 2 floors, it was also completely possible that Ashton's body was just buried under debris and not located by rescue efforts. Now, I don't want to sound like a Philistine here, but the idea of finding the remains of a person not recovered was enticing. I'm not gonna lie. The clout that allowing a family to lay their loved one to rest could bring would be more than worth its weight in gold. Might even make the local authorities consider not pressing charges for trespassing. While that wasn't likely, I decided that it would be worth the risk in the end. Even if I didn't find the remains of Clark Ashton, which I honestly didn't think that I would, I knew that I could deliver an exploration video that no one had dared to try yet. I could film the top 2 floors. It would be dangerous, of course, but I'd go prepared, and I'd be careful. Even if all I could manage was footage of the 4th and 5th floor taken from the stairwell doorway, that would be more than anyone else had done, which would bring views, and more importantly, it would give me the reputation of someone who dares to go where others will not. Once I made my decision to do an exploration of the hotel, I spent a few months saving up for the trip and making sure that I had all the gear that I would need. Flashlights, batteries, crowbar, dust masks rated for protection against mold, survival knife, etc. 4 months later, I set out for Coleman, Virginia in mid-April. I drove because I've always had an irrational fear of flying, but seeing as I was living in Massachusetts at the time, it wasn't that bad of a drive. I checked into a Super 8 that was about a mile away from the Shady Willow, got a good night's rest, and killed time the next day waiting for the sun to go down. If you know anything about urban exploration, you know that it's best done under the cover of darkness. There's no secret that it's not exactly the most legal of hobbies, and anyone who takes an interest in it has to get comfortable walking straight past those no trespassing signs and be prepared for the possible litigation they may face after doing so. I arrived at the Shady Willow a little after 10 p.m., parking my car in the shadow of the large hotel. The area surrounding the abandoned structure wasn't very active, the only businesses in operation being a gas station and a small local bar about 2 blocks away. I still sat in my car with all the lights off for another 15 minutes, checking for any foot traffic that might pass by. Seeing none, I made my way to the front doors of the hotel. The night air was humid but cool, the night sky overcast, seeming to collude with me by providing the cover of darkness as I stuck close to the building just in case anyone was in the vicinity that might see me. I made it to the front entrance without issue, and 5 minutes later had pried 2 2x4s that were nailed across the door loose and slipped inside. I wish I could say that I got a bad feeling when I entered the Shady Willow, that something felt off. I wish I could say that I felt the presence of something sinister and could hear a faint alarm going off in my mind, like a survival instinct that I didn't even know that I had. But there was nothing. I clicked on my flashlight and saw the long abandoned lobby standing before me. Truth be told, the lobby was in pretty good shape considering the period of time that it had stood empty. I could clearly see that in its day, the Shady Willow had been a pretty swanky place. 15-foot-high ceilings, with what appeared to be chandeliers once hanging from them. A large dining area to the left of the front desk itself looking to have been made out of some high-quality wood. But now, it was just a hollowed-out shell of what it once had been, with dust that was easily an inch thick covering almost every surface. There were signs of weather damage, of course, peeled paint, warped spots in the floor and ceiling, the smell of mildew hanging in the air. There were less broken windows than I was expecting, but I was assuming that the hotel probably still held an ominous aura locally, likely keeping the local hooligans away out of superstitious fear. I made my way through the lobby relatively quickly, seeing as every video that had been uploaded about the hotel featured this area rather heavily. I did stop to get some footage of the empty elevator shaft, however. The doors were propped open, the elevator car not in sight, only an empty cavern of darkness. I was going to skip over the rest of the lobby almost altogether after getting some footage of the dust-covered front desk, but stopped when I saw the seating area most hotels have adjacent to the check-in. The furniture was arranged in a rough circle like it was being used as a makeshift meeting area. There was a love seat, 3 recliners, and 4 chairs that looked like they had been brought over from the dining area. While the visual of the dusty, molded furniture was slightly off-putting on its own, it was the thought that other people frequented this hotel that put me on edge. I had a feeling that I likely would not want to run into anyone who found this place a convenient hangout. But with the front entrance boarded up, there must have been another entrance that whoever had moved the furniture was using. Unless, of course, it was done by the rescue workers who were taking a break. I thought to myself rationally. Look at the dust. No one has sat in these chairs for years. Looking again, I realized that my inner voice was correct. There looked to be about an inch of dust on each chair, no sign that they had been disturbed recently. I left the lobby behind, making my way down the hallway to my right, to where I assumed that the staircase would be. The hallways were dark, which was expected, but I had brought a good flashlight that banished most of the darkness. It didn't, however, banish the unsettling nature of the vacant hall. Hotel hallways had always struck me as naturally creepy to begin with. The thick carpet on the floors that seems to muffle all sounds. The line of doors on both sides always made it easy to imagine someone reaching out and grabbing you as you walked by. Of course, I thought about this while I walked down the first floor hallway towards the stairwell, putting myself more on edge than I needed to be, but unable to stop thinking about the empty rooms that lay behind the doors I was passing. Once I arrived at the stairwell, most of the anxiousness I had been feeling had passed, and I was feeling more myself again. The door to the stairs was still propped open by a heavy block, which I imagined had been placed there during the search and rescue efforts. I made my way up to the second floor, and again didn't linger there too long. I walked down the hallway leading in both directions, getting some footage as I did so. I peeked into one of the room doors that was open, getting some B-roll of the dust-covered, mold-smelling room that lay beyond the threshold. Like the first floor, the second floor hadn't been damaged in the fire, so it only gave off the feeling of neglect that every abandoned building did. But once I reached the third floor, all of that changed. As I made my way down the first hallway of the third floor, I could see faint black spots that looked like scorch marks on the ceiling above me. Most of the doors on the third floor were propped open, the empty rooms making me feel on edge again as I explored. I could easily imagine the panicked guests fleeing on the night of the fire, stampeding down the halls as the alarm blared, and the heat from the floors above them pressing down like a physical presence. In my heightened state, I almost thought I could hear them screaming in fear and calling out to those who were with them, asking others if anyone knew what was going on. I could almost smell the acrid smoke that must have been invading their nostrils as they fled towards the stairs. I had figured I would make a complete circuit of each floor, since every floor was a rectangle that would lead me back to the stairwell every time, as long as there was no debris blocking my way and the floor beneath me remained solid, that is. Halfway through my circuit of the third floor, I thought that I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a quick flash of movement. But when I turned my head, there was nothing. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me, since I had learned long ago that happened quite often in abandoned buildings. The mind doesn't like the dark, and will often go into hyperdrive when in an unfamiliar setting. The imagination fills in the unknown with all sorts of things, as it's never the dark that is frightening, but all of the imagined terrors that might be hiding in that darkness. In urban exploration, it is key to get that part of your mind under control. That being said, I was still on edge, and I began imagining that I could hear footsteps just a little behind me, as if they were coming from the hallway I had just been in. Of course I looked. I'm human after all, but still saw nothing. When I turned down the final hall that would lead me back to the stairwell, I was convinced that I saw the shape of a young woman with her back to me. Her hair extended down between her shoulder blades. The clothes on her body were slightly scorched, smoke seeming to rise off of her. I jumped, blinked, and then she was gone. You need to get a hold of yourself, I thought at the time. In hindsight, I should have taken that as my cue to leave, but I didn't believe in ghosts, goblins, or anything of that nature. I had been in enough abandoned areas to know that hallucinations are quite common when the mind is on edge. That in my opinion, a lot of the ghost hunting shows that had become popular around that time were full of people who let their imaginations get the best of them. That I didn't think that they were lying exactly, but that they were letting their preconceptions about the area they were in make them see what they were expecting to see. Shaking it off, I continued towards the stairwell and made my way up to the 4th floor. Here, the damage from the fire was readily apparent. The walls were scorched black in many places, as well as the ceiling. The smell of moldy wood and plaster hanging in the air. I put one of my dust masks on and proceeded carefully, checking the ceiling for cracks, and checking my footing in areas that appeared to be sagging slightly. Many of the doors to the rooms on the 4th floor were removed entirely, as this floor must have been heavily searched in the aftermath of the fire. The rooms beyond were devastated, ash and debris everywhere, blackened beds and dressers, burned carpets. I could hear the voices of those who had been burned to death within some of these rooms. They were shouting out in fear and agony. I even thought I could smell faint wisps of smoke underneath the smell of mold. The voices continued to follow me as I wandered the 4th floor, my imagination in full force. Most of what they said was unintelligible, but a few times I thought I could hear someone say, "Get out. You have to get out." I kept ignoring them, chalking it up to an effect of the atmosphere and the sight of the destruction caused by the fire, but it was getting harder to do. I kept seeing things out of the edge of my vision, too. Quick, dark shapes that slipped around corners and into open rooms, constantly staying just out of sight when I turned in their direction. I almost went back down when I reached the staircase. In hindsight, I probably should have, but maybe it was already too late even then. I don't know. What I do know is that when I reached the stairs, I went up to the 5th floor. The devastation of the 5th floor was almost frightening to look at when I first stepped out of the stairwell. Seeing what fire could leave behind, and knowing that not a single person who was on this floor made it out alive, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I cautiously began walking down the first hall, partly taking my time for safety concerns, but mostly because I didn't want to be in here anymore. There was an oppressive feeling on the 5th floor, and the sight of the burned walls, ceiling, and floor did nothing to help that feeling. The carpet of the hall had been all but completely burned away, leaving ash that was piled in along the sides of the walls in its wake. The wallpaper was likewise mostly burned away, the ceiling sagging in several spots. The window at the end of the first hall had been busted open, allowing the cool night air into the building, dispersing some of the smell of mold and mildew, along with the phantom smell of smoke that had gotten stronger up here. I figured I could abandon the expedition at any time for safety reasons, and said as much while I was recording. But seeing as I was already there, I decided I would push as far as I could until either safety or my own imagination forced me to turn around. I say my imagination because the voices were almost constant now. Many of them were screaming, some crying in fear. Some were even laughing as if the hopelessness of their situation had broken their minds. I figured I would round into the third hall and then turn around and leave. I had gotten enough footage and gone further than anyone had before me. This would have to be enough. Then I saw the body on the floor halfway down the hall, just outside of an open door. I froze in place when I saw it. It appeared to be the body of a grown man, and at first I thought that maybe it was another explorer or a homeless man who had been squatting up here. "Hello?" I said, hoping that maybe the individual was sleeping and not dead. "Hello, sir? Are you okay?" There was no response. I took a step towards the body, meaning to check for a pulse. Knowing that the expedition was over, I'd have to call 911, get paramedics, police, whoever else, and just face the music for trespassing. I couldn't just leave the body here if the man was dead. I approached a little closer when the man began to move. I jumped a little in surprise, but then breathed a sigh of relief. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need any help?" I said as the man slowly rose to his feet. He didn't respond to me, and I was about to ask again when I noticed the smoke rising from his body. He stood up to full height and turned his head in my direction. I took a step back when I saw the charred remains of his face, an empty eye socket gazing right at me, the smoke rising from his body becoming more severe and inexplicably starting to claw at my throat.
"You shouldn't be here,"
the man said in a voice that sounded ageless.
"You should go before they come."
Once he was done speaking, the man turned away from me and began walking down the hall, before fading away into smoke. "Fuck this," I said explosively, and turned on my heels to start making my way back to the stairs. Expedition was over, even if that was my imagination. I rounded the corner and made a little progress back the way I had come when I saw a humanoid figure rising straight up from the floor, as if it was formed by the ashes that lined the hallway. It solidified before my very eyes, and I found myself looking at a charred person. The face completely burned away, leaving only a skull that was burned black. It reached for me, and I backed away from it so fast I almost lost my balance. I let out a scream and it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stood frozen in place for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wanted to leave, desperately wanted to leave, but I didn't want to walk past where that thing had been. Was it still there? Would it grab me as I walked by? Had it been there in the first place? I was convinced that it had been. From behind me, I heard a scuttling sound. I turned around quickly and let out another cry as I saw what looked like a mound of flesh, shaped like a beetle or an ant, clumsily walking towards me on legs that looked like rib bones. There were several more of these shapes crawling along the walls and the ceiling, all blindly making their way in my direction. The sounds of their legs walking on the wood of the hallway was undeniable, and I decided to take my chances passing by the humanoid figure I had seen and backed away from the advancing horrors. But just as the charred person had done, these figures also dissipated and vanished, leaving behind only wisps of smoke that stank of sulfur. I turned and began running towards the staircase. Impressions entered my mind as I fled down the hall. It's difficult to explain. It was as if I was seeing two worlds at once. There was the physical reality that I could see, but then there was what I could see in my mind's eye. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but I'll try to elaborate. As I moved down the hall, I saw the same hallway I had seen before. Burnt walls, burnt ceiling, burnt carpet and floor. But in my mind, I saw an inhuman head crawling towards me, collecting the ash from the floor and forming a body behind itself as it approached. That body solidifying into an almost canine shape that looked to be made out of the charred and mangled remains of the people that had perished in the fire, right down to a screaming face on one of the creature's shoulders. It looked as if it were lunging towards me, this giving me a shock so bad that I fell onto my ass trying to retreat. But then it was gone. I'd hear a growl coming from beside me and turn my head to see spider-like legs wrapped around a doorway, the head of a beast with glowing red eyes leering at me from above the header, black smoke pouring out of the sides of the door, all but obscuring the creature. But then I'd also see an open, empty room just as I had before. These things weren't there, but they were there, if that makes any sense. It's as if I was sensing their presence and somehow seeing them within my mind, even though physically there was nothing. At one point, right before I reached the stairs, I was surrounded by the burned and burning bodies of the guests that had perished all those years ago. Their screams of pain were deafening, the smell of burning flesh nauseating, the sensation of heat upon my skin almost overwhelming. And then it was gone, and I was fleeing down the stairs, the sounds of chanting pursuing me, inhuman sounds from below waiting to greet me. But I pushed forward, hoping that I was having a panic attack and hallucinating, even as I saw a hulking beast moving quickly down the hall on the 4th floor towards the stairwell. As I rounded the corner and made to keep heading down, there was a wall of flesh that seemed to be blocking my path. Charred human faces screaming in agony, their hands reaching towards me in desperation. I backed away, and something grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back into the hallway on the 4th floor. A burning sensation unlike anything I had ever felt lit up my right shoulder in pain, and I cried out as I landed hard on my back, a snarling sound filling my ears, the feeling of hot breath against my face, and then nothing. I quickly scrambled to my feet and saw that I was alone again. My shoulder, however, was still in extreme pain, feeling as if it had been burned. I approached the staircase again, and the wall of flesh was gone. I continued to make my way down the stairs, now taking 2 at a time. The smell of sulfur was everywhere now, and the voices were unceasing, although most seemed to be laughing as I fled. The impressions of horrors unseen kept intruding into my mind, showing me the things that were lurking in the rooms and halls of the 3rd and 2nd floors as I barreled past them. Creatures made of ash and smoke, and many who were composed of the burned remains of the hotel's victims, all stalking the halls, all making their way towards me as if I was a light in the darkness surrounded by moths. Sunlight was filtering through the windows that I could see, although I didn't know how that could be possible. I didn't feel as if I had been within this wretched place all night. I paid that idea no mind, though, and continued on until I reached the 1st floor. There were more horrors awaiting me within the 1st floor hallway. Canine-looking creatures with human faces. Charred humanoid bodies that were too tall and too thin to actually be human, melted mounds of flesh with faces slithering along the floor and ceiling, all of them growling or making strange chittering sounds as they wandered the hall and ducked in and out of rooms. An oppressive heat began to engulf me, the smell of sulfur becoming almost overwhelming, making me gag even through the mask I was wearing. I did not want to enter that hallway with those creatures, even though, as I was seeing them, I was also seeing the normal hall I had already passed through earlier in the evening. The abominations were not visibly there, but I knew that they were there all the same. And considering that one of them had already grabbed me, or at least something had upstairs, I was no longer sure that these things couldn't touch me, as my shoulder still burned with pain. I decided that I would just run down the hall, trying to avoid the horrors that seemed to wander blindly. While it wasn't the best plan, it was at least something, because I had to get out of here. The heat around me was increasing, and I was already feeling faint. If I didn't get out soon, I would fall unconscious, and what would happen then I couldn't bear to ponder. Taking as deep a breath as I could, given the suffocating stench of sulfur, I began running down the hall. The abominations took notice of me as soon as I exited the staircase. But rather than rush at me and tear me apart with their jaws and bony fingers and talons, they moved aside, as if inviting me to leave. I still ran all the same, my head swiveling as I tried to watch for hostile movement. But there was none. The creatures gave me a path, and a few of the ones with humanoid faces appeared to be smiling at me. Some of them were whispering,
Go forth. Escape.
As I ran by. When I reached the lobby, I stopped again. Above me, there was something that looked like a massive ball of deformed and charred bodies stuck to the ceiling by several tentacle-like appendages. A foul-smelling, oily substance was dripping from the mass and pooling on the floor underneath it. As if noticing my presence, the tentacles began to break loose from the ceiling with wet popping sounds, and the ball of charred humans fell to the floor, opening up as it did so, as if something had been curled in the fetal position upside down. The tentacles extended out as the mass of burned flesh fell, reaching the floor and slowing the descent of the horror. Once it had settled, it appeared to be standing on the serpentine limbs, a fiery appendage sprouting from the back of the ball like a tail. The oily ichor dripping from the thing, some of it solidifying, forming things that looked like the feelers of an insect that twitched convulsively. And then it finished opening up, a head emerging from the center, revealing a face that looked like a cross between a gorilla and a horse. I looked on in shocked horror at a gaping mouth that was full of broken, jagged teeth, a pair of glowing red eyes glaring down at me from a creature that had to duck down inside the lobby with its 15-foot-high ceilings. The body of the horror was clearly composed of burnt human corpses, their hands reaching out of it, clutching for anything as if seeking escape from this hellish form. The creature let out an unearthly roar and leaned down towards me. I wanted to run, but was frozen in place as the abomination drew closer. An unbearable heat baked off of the monster's charred skin, the smell of sulfur becoming overpowering. I retched, coughed, my knees buckled, and I passed out. I regained consciousness an unknown amount of time later, and scrambled to my feet, my head aching from where it must have struck the floor. The creature was gone, as was the smell of sulfur and the oppressive heat that had become all-encompassing. The sun was fully up now, meaning I had been unconscious for a few hours at least. I didn't know what had happened. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? I turned towards the front entrance, and for a moment thought that I saw the form of a horned being smiling at me. But when I blinked, it was gone. When I walked through the front door, I could have sworn that I heard hundreds of voices whisper,
"Thank you."
At the time, I was positive that I had experienced some form of temporary psychotic break, or that maybe there had been a combination of fumes on the 5th floor that had caused vivid hallucinations and brought on a panic attack due to lack of oxygen. 5 years have passed since that night, and now I think differently. The last 5 years have been full of nothing but misfortune and tragedy. But not for me, for all those around me. Family members, friends, co-workers, even acquaintances have all experienced strife. From terminal illness to fatal car accidents, to suicides, to murders, to unexplained disappearances. Everyone in my life has been picked off one by one. First those who were close to me, and then people I interacted with but barely knew, as if I am a curse. Yet I remain unharmed, successful in everything I try, in fact. I thought nothing of it at first. Bad things happen, after all. But over the years, I would remember what I had experienced within the Shady Willow Hotel. The voices that were urging me to escape. The creatures that had moved out of my path. The chorus of thank yous as I had exited the doors. I now think I have something of an answer. I'm still not sure if Clark Ashton set the fire in the Shady Willow or just tragically vanished during the event. But I'm almost positive that that fire had invited something into that hotel. I've become obsessed with occult research over the last couple of years, and while much of it is all over the place and unreliable, as you might imagine, there is a common belief shared by many. That belief is that a catastrophic event involving the loss of human life can sometimes attract dark and twisted spirits, as if they are nourished by places of misery and death. Fires with mass casualties, murder houses, condemned hospitals and asylums, places where humans suffered or indulged in their worst instincts. Spirits that can only be described as demonic and evil. Things that are usually unnoticed by human senses can come to dwell within these places and cross over into our reality. These things that are normally unseen can now be perceived by those who wander unknowingly into their domain. I think the spirits that dwelled within the Shady Willow were trapped in there and used me as a vessel to escape. That they had latched on to me either while I was exploring that cursed building or while I had been unconscious and helpless. I think I had known that even back then. If not on top, then in the mind under my mind, that I had ignored the feeling of being stained, of being defiled. The same way I had ignored the scars on my right shoulder, the scars that I had rationalized were scrapes from when I had collapsed in the lobby, even though they clearly looked like burns that were in the shape of a hand with 3 long fingers. I'm going back to the Shady Willow tonight. I'm writing this in the same Super 8 that I had stayed in 5 years ago. I've got 7 5-gallon tanks of gasoline in the backseat of my car. I don't know if that will be enough, but I have to try. I'll start on the 3rd floor and work my way down to the lobby. I'll then light the entire thing and hope that that goddamn place finally burns to the ground. The things that live there might try and stop me, but that's okay. I don't plan on leaving that place. I won't let them use me to bring death to all those I encounter. The only thing I wonder is if I'll pass on to an afterlife, or if I'll be added to the collection of spirits trapped within the shady willow if I fail. Will I become a part of that monstrosity that nests within the lobby? Will I await another wayward explorer, perhaps someone who comes looking for my missing body? Will I cheer them as they escape, providing me with a way out of my hell? Will my tortured soul seek vengeance upon the living once I'm free? Or will I remain trapped, watching the demons who had been drawn to that place leave as I exist in eternal torment? I don't know. And honestly, I don't care. One way or another, this has to end. I can't live with the guilt of what I have caused. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me. If I'm lucky, I'll end up as a charred skeleton buried within a pile of ash, wood, and metal. If I'm unlucky, and that hotel still stands after I light it on fire, please stay away, far away, because there are dark and twisted things dwelling inside of the shady willow, eagerly awaiting your visit, desperately wishing to be free once more. And as far as I know, I might be one of them. Thank you for joining us here at Nightmares Incorporated, and we hope to see you again next week when we bring you another tale of the macabre. Until then, sweet dreams.